Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, gun violence in America. Our guest, Claire Hogan, spokesperson at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Claire Hogan, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Claire, two versions of the issue. One version is America doesn't have a gun problem. It has a violence problem. Another version, America doesn't have just a gun problem, it has several of them. What is the situation according to your take?
Well, I think you can look at it in a combination of ways. The United States has more guns than any other country in the world.
About 300 million?
Yeah, we have more gun violence than any other country in the world, so I don't think that's a coincidence. If you look at it like that, you can directly correlate more guns equals more gun violence. And we have limited regulations on guns. Pretty much anyone in this country can obtain a gun, they can obtain an assault weapon, and that's just leading to mass violence. And it's also important to recognize that not only is there mass violence in the country, but there's violence every day in communities. About 100 Americans are killed every day by a gun, whether it's through these mass shootings that we see in the news, and also, the shootings that don't make the news. So shootings that are happening every day in communities, in neighborhoods, incidents of domestic violence and firearm suicide. 60% of firearm death is in the form of suicide.
About what, close to 100 suicides a day?
It's 100 firearm deaths a day, but roughly 60%.
And in the case of suicides, going back to the version that America doesn't have a gun problem, it has a violence problem. The people who have that theory, it says, a kid that reached the age of 18 in the US has been exposed through his or her life to thousands of hours of cartoons with violent scenes, movies, any type of media that basically is pushing them that violence is in front of their eyes. That could bring the issue of mental health in this equation?
So there actually is not a strong correlation between mental health and gun violence. People with mental illness are more likely to hurt themselves than they are to hurt others. And in the case of video games and seeing violence on TV or something like that, every country has violence on television and that sort of thing, and you don't see dramatic gun violence happening in other countries. So I don't think that can be drawn as a strong correlation to what's happening in the US. The difference is that the US has easy access to firearms, and that's what's causing this violence, is people with dangerous behavior are able to get access to guns, whereas in other countries they're not.
If I want to play devil's advocate, the reason that you are fat is that there's a cane sugar grower. Because there's sugar, you ended up being obese. Because there's a gun, you ended up using guns. And what are the, if you want, the behavior that you decide that even though there is sugar cane at your hand, you don't get obese, you don't exceed the use of something. You have a gun. If you don't feel to resolve the problems of your life, the gun could be a gun, because basically, playing the devil's advocate, if you want, the slogan of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, is guns don't kill people, people kills people. What do you have to say to that sort of argument?
Well, I think it just goes back to the argument that having a gun accessible doesn't really, it eliminates the decision-making time. So for example, in the instance of firearm suicide, a person who is having suicidal thoughts, and if they have a gun available to them, there's not that time for them to reconsider. If they have a gun available and they are wanting to harm themselves, it's just going to make it that much easier. Whereas, if they don't have that in their home, they're more likely to take the time and reconsider and seek help. So it's kind of that situation where having a gun near you or in your home in a time of crisis or something like that is just going to make it that much easier to cause harm to others or yourself.
Tell us, to an audience that is not living in the US, what is so intrinsic in the American culture, the relation with guns?
The American culture with guns is very different and unique to this country. I think it is completely different from any other place in the world. You know, on one side, people love to hunt, and that's totally fine. And I think that, you know, everyone should be able to own a firearm if they would like to, but there is this false idea that having a gun in your home will make you safer, or, you know, something along those lines, when actually the evidence shows that it doesn't make you safer. It you know, increases the probability that you will be injured or killed with a firearm by having a gun in your home. So there's just a lot of false narratives out there that I think American society clings to. And, you know, I think that the fact that our legislators haven't really done anything to regulate firearms in this country has negatively impacted how our society looks at guns. And, you know, especially right now with the president that we have, who is projecting a lot of hateful and racist rhetoric, it's almost as if he's inciting violence against people. And so we've seen this rise in armed hatred and this rise in violence towards minorities as a result of the president's rhetoric.
So there's a relation between the exacerbation of violence through the words of the rhetoric of President Trump and people reacting to solving their differences, quote unquote differences, or intolerance through guns, like the massacres that we've seen recently in El Paso and Dayton.
Yeah, and El Paso was the second massacre within a week that, you know, the shooter had expressed racist and hateful views towards a minority, or, you know, towards a group of people. And
so much so that he, after being arrested, he said that the purpose of his action was to kill as many Mexicans as he could, and he wanted to stop the invasion of Hispanics in Texas.
Exactly. And as horrible as that is, you know, before this president, we weren't seeing the same kind of those views before President Trump would have been condemned immediately and recognized as white supremacist and hateful and unacceptable. Whereas President Trump has said things along those lines, hateful things towards immigrants that aren't true, you know, calling them rapists and murderers, and, you know, essentially just overarching racist views towards any people of color in this country, especially immigrants. So we almost feel as though by him expressing that rhetoric, he's emboldening these people within the United States who have those fringe views, and he's emboldening them to take armed action.
How do you explain that when President Barack Obama reached the Oval Office, the White House, the presidency, the sales of guns increased significantly?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a lot of racism in this country, and there's an idea of insurrectionism is what it's called. So it's basically that the public, or, you know, its citizens are preparing to overthrow the government. They're preparing to defend themselves against a government that they feel is infringing upon their rights. So, you know, most likely people, if they didn't support President Obama and were afraid of where his administration would go, they armed themselves for that impending, overarching government power, so which is pretty harmful.
That's exactly the real beginning of the whole issue with the Second Amendment in the Constitution. They were feeling that militias representing the government could take over rights of the regular citizen, and therefore the citizen was arming himself or herself against the possibility of the quote-unquote government coming to invade my rights and everything. And then it evolved through the years, and now most of the people say, I feel safe with a gun in my home, because if I call the police and take some time, I cannot afford not to react immediately. It's a little bit like that.
Yeah, and it's, I think that there is a lot of harmful rhetoric in the idea that people are anti-Second Amendment, or that groups like mine, like the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, that we want to take away guns, which is not the case at all. We, completely support responsible gun owners. It is the issue of regulating it to the extent where people who shouldn't have guns, people who have expressed desire to hurt others or hurt themselves, aren't able to get guns. But there are these two competing narratives of the public, of some gun owners thinking that, oh, the government wants to take my guns. And that's just not the reality. The reality is the government should be taking steps to make sure that all gun owners are responsible.
Let's follow economics. Bernie Sanders, clearly he says, the government in Washington is corrupt. The congressmen are bought by the big interests. Among the big interests, the National Rifle Association, which really pushes all type of legislation to deregulate the sale of guns. Even they contribute to the campaigns of the congressmen. So when you're mentioning the government should do this and that, if the government is corrupted at the service of the corporations who manufacture guns, and they make billions selling guns, so much that you have 300 million guns for about 320 million Americans, how are you going to fight or to swim against the tide with that sort of monster of influence in the legislation? It's a big challenge for you guys?
Of course, but in reality, the tide is changing. The NRA used to be an entity that represented the responsible gun owner. It was hunting and that type of field, but now it's more of a fringe group. It doesn't actually represent the interests of the responsible gun owner, peripheral type of group of extremists, and they're not as powerful as they seem. Whereas 10 years ago, their endorsement was a sought-after endorsement for a lot of Republicans especially. Now it's becoming toxic. The tide is completely shifting on this issue. The majority of Americans are in support of
gun legislation.
Of gun legislation. They don't want to see any more people killed. And it's getting to the point where it's ridiculous, and the NRA is just falling apart within themselves and in the eyes of the American people. So yeah, there have been issues where legislators take money from the NRA and then they're not supporting common sense gun reform, but that is not the case anymore. The NRA is not as powerful as it used to be. It's not very powerful at all anymore. And I think even Republicans who were staunchly, with the NRA on this issue are coming around, and there's even Republicans now that are introducing common sense gun laws to be considered, and I think that's really significant.
So the Senate leader, we're talking about Mitch McConnell, has said in recent days that he is ready to consider some gun reform or whatever after the recess that ends at the beginning of September. Nancy Pelosi is telling President Trump to use his powers to convoke a special emergency session of the Congress to start the legislation. How optimistic are you that something happens, and how should be fixed this problem?
So I think it is important to note that a lot has happened on a state level. So, we're talking about what's going on in Washington and all of these representatives, but in reality, there's a lot of movement on the state level and a lot has happened. So, we are optimistic. It is great that Mitch McConnell said that. I think we need to be realistic and see where it actually goes. I think that especially with the most recent mass shootings that happened within 24 hours of each other, in El Paso and Dayton, I think that he and a lot of the Republicans in higher power are feeling the pressure and they can't ignore it anymore. So that may be a big indicator of why he said that and why he was willing to bring it up. But I think we're just waiting to see if that actually happens. I know in the upcoming elections, we're hoping to, he's not exactly been great on this issue.
Is it to be an issue in the coming elections?
I think
gun
it
control?
will be. I think that it's been one of the key issues, and it should remain the key issue.
What about your organization? What are you guys doing in order to try to stop that craziness of guns in the wrong hands?
So there are a couple pieces of legislation that we're very passionate about. Extreme risk protection orders have been in the news a lot recently, and we actually, along with several academics who work in violence research, created those laws back in 2013. So
what are the laws about?
So they're called extreme risk laws or extreme risk protection orders, sometimes called red flag laws. And essentially, they are a way for friends and family and law enforcement to temporarily remove guns from someone who is, experiencing crisis, or they've expressed
some mental illnesses or this.
Well, so it's important not to confuse it with mental illness, but it's someone who has basically, expressed desire to hurt others or themselves. But it's not a mental illness legislation, and as I mentioned before, there isn't really a strong correlation between mental illness and gun violence.
And then you said a second thing that your organization is pushing.
And also universal background checks are just pretty, explanatory. They should just, there's no reason for us to not have universal background checks. You should not just be able to walk off the street and buy a gun anywhere.
And what about if you want war type of weapons?
That's another thing that we are, in favor of, banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, which no civilian should have access to. You can't use them for hunting. You're not going to use them to protect yourself. They're made to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. Those are weapons of war, and there's no reason that the average civilian should have access to.
Internet. Everyone says that you can buy a weapon through internet, and even in the streets or in gun shows.
So that would be covered under universal background checks, covering the sales online and at gun shows, because right now those are loopholes in the current background checks legislation. So, pushing forward universal background checks would cover those loopholes. And I think, and also another very important area to cover is more funding for gun violence prevention research. This is a public health issue. It's a public health epidemic affecting our country, and it needs to be treated as such. So there needs to be more funding from the government to research the root causes of this issue. And there also needs to be more funding for community programs for community violence intervention.
So where the resistance to all that proposals are going to come from that you can anticipate?
I think that just, where it has been coming from, the gun lobby, and as I mentioned, the gun lobby is getting smaller and they're getting less powerful. But I think the resistance comes from that false idea that this is going to take our guns away, which just isn't the truth. So I think that this is a winning issue, and there will always be resistance to any issue, but the majority of Americans are on our side.
When you see the whole picture, it's considered a massacre if 4 people are being killed in an incident, and we're talking that we are in about 220 days of this year, and it has already been more than 255 massacres, more than 1 a day as an average. Concerns you?
Definitely. And those are just shootings that make the news. There are so many that don't. There are so many shootings that happen every day in communities, especially in communities of color. And I think that it's really important to recognize that gun violence is so much more than mass shootings. It's affecting people on a daily basis. It's a domestic violence issue. It's a firearm suicide issue, and it's an impacted communities issue. So it does concern me that the rate at which we're going in this year, and it's going to continue like that, I'm afraid, unless our legislators step up and make significant change.
Are you optimistic to push legislation to make it sort of in a better?
I am very optimistic. I think our entire organization and the gun violence prevention movement itself is very optimistic. As I mentioned before, it's a winning issue. Everyone in the United States wants gun violence prevention. They want gun reform.
Yeah, 2 out of 3 Americans at the least.
Yes, and I think it's just a matter of our legislators listening to us and listening to the American people and doing what they want.
Claire Hogan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.